Thank you, Lucille. Did you like that poem? As I said, it's quite an old poem, and I first heard it as a late teenager, early 20s. But there's just something about it that resonates with me, that even the best sermons may not be in words. There may be, no matter how good the sermon is, the best way to show God's love or to explain what it means to follow Jesus is through our actions. So today I want to try and explore this idea of practicing what we preach. Or maybe that's my message for today, for me. And it brings it up nicely because last week Kevin introduced the fact that we had moved out of John and now we're moving into our block of the year that we look at the New Testament. And our mini theme in the lead up to Pentecost is this idea of spreading the good news. Spreading the good news. How do we go with sharing the good news? The good news, the whole idea of evangelism and telling other people about Jesus. Like when I was a teenager, I was a passionate evangelist. I had no problems at all talking to anybody I saw about Jesus. As I've grown older, I've found that much, much harder to do. And I wonder whether it's because I've changed or whether the society that we live in has changed. Probably a bit of both. But I actually think it's quite difficult and tricky to find the opportunities to talk to people about our faith now. It's almost like people say to us, that's okay, you can have faith, but it's your faith. You keep it personal to you. It's hard to do. And we've got this theme at the moment of what does it mean to spread the good news for the next couple of weeks. How do we actually work through this in a practical way in the society that we are in now? Kevin introduced us last week to Saul/Paul, who was the superhero when it comes to evangelism and missionary work in the early church. Kevin told the story last week of Paul's conversion and the dramatic turnaround from Paul being the persecutor, the one who was, killing Christians, right through to being one of these most influential people in the New Testament. It's hard to overstate just how significant Paul became. He travelled widely, he planted churches, he wrote letters. About a third of the New Testament is Paul. He shaped the life and the theology of the early church in extraordinary ways. And whilst I want to argue this morning that yes, a lot of Paul's impact came from his ability to be able to speak and teach and persuade and communicate. His words were very powerful. As I said, a third of the New Testament are still Paul's words that we use now. But this morning I want us to notice something else, that some of Paul's best moments of sharing the good news actually happened when he sat down and didn't say much at all. So to give you some context, a lot has happened since the reading we had last week from Acts chapter 9 and the reading we had this morning from Acts chapter 16. There was a lot of things that happened in those 7 chapters. So let me give you a quick recap. So Acts chapter 9 we had last week was the conversion of Paul. But then Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, he also wrote the Gospel of Luke, but when Luke then switches his focus away from Paul. So Paul gets converted, and then for the next couple of chapters, Luke focuses on Peter and Peter's leadership and Peter's learning in the early church. And Paul doesn't really re-emerge until Acts chapter 13, where Paul is commissioned by the early church to go and take the good news or to share the good news to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. And Paul launches himself into that, and immediately he goes on his first missionary journey. By Acts 16, which is our Bible reading today, he's actually into his second missionary journey and has crossed over into Macedonia and arrives at the city of Philippi. Now, I just want to pause on Philippi just for a second. It's actually quite interesting that in a few weeks' time, as part of our journey through the New Testament, we are actually going to spend 4 weeks in the book of Philippians. And so it's quite interesting that today we get sort of like the sneak peek of what we're just about to look at, or the backstory of what we're just about to look at. This is the story that we had this morning of how the church in Philippi started, and then we're going to be looking at for 4 weeks, in a few weeks' time, Paul's letter to the Philippians. Philippi is an interesting city. It is strongly Roman, and I'm not overstating that either. Philippi was one of the few places outside of Italy that was officially Roman land. It was started by the Romans. It was a very Roman city. And as such, it was shaped by Roman culture, Roman power, Roman values. There was no synagogue in Philippi because it was such a Roman city. They didn't have a Jewish synagogue there. So Paul's usual way of doing his sharing the good news is he would rock up to a new town, he would go to a synagogue, go to the local synagogue and start teaching the Jewish people about Jesus. That's what he did in many of the towns that he does in his missionary journeys. But he can't do that in Philippi because there's no synagogue there. So instead he goes where people gathers. Now we didn't read the first part of chapter 16 because when he arrives in Philippi he actually goes down to the river where he meets with some people down there, including Lydia, who is the dealer of purple cloth. And Lydia hears the words that Paul is speaking, and her heart is open to that. And she responds and she accepts the message, the good news of Jesus, and she invites Paul to stay at her place while he's at Philippi. And Lydia actually becomes one of the key leaders of the Philippian church. So that's the part of the Bible reading we skipped over out of 16. In that story with Lydia, you can see Paul's words in actions here, can't you? Paul is a great communicator. He shares the gospel with words. Lydia's heart's open. She responds. She accepts Jesus. That's what Paul does really well. But the two stories that we heard in our Bible reading today are different. And it's almost like we get another picture of what it means to share the good news. And I think it's helpful because sometimes we think that if we're going to do evangelism or to share the good news, we've got to be like Paul and we need to go. We need to go out of the church. We need to go into the community. We need to be like a missionary and go to the other side of the world. We need to go to people and we need to interrupt them and tell them about Jesus. Certainly that is a part of what evangelism is about. But in the readings we had today, Paul doesn't chase these opportunities. The opportunities arise and then he interacts with them. I just want to double down on this because I want to say that sometimes sharing the good news does not begin with a grand initiative like Paul, I'm going to go on a missionary journey. And sometimes it doesn't even start with carefully crafted words. If I just know the right things to say, then people will believe. Sometimes sharing the good news begins with us being present and loving and ready to respond where we already are. As I said, there's two stories in our Bible reading that's about this. I'm just going to step through these two stories in which we see the best and the worst of Paul. The first story that we had in our Bible reading from Acts 16, I find uncomfortable because there's a lot of things just below the surface of that reading that are difficult to try and hold together. It is the story of an enslaved girl who has a gift of insight or discernment. We're not quite sure how she can do this, but she is able to predict the future. Some commentaries that I read wanted to rush very quickly and label her as evil. It was an evil spirit that was able to do this. But Luke never mentions that. Luke seems to be more focused on the fact that she is enslaved, that the fact that there are people who have trapped her in a situation and are misusing her so they can make money out of this. So she's the one in chains here. And the other weird part about this part of the story is that she's the one who's actually speaking truth. Like, what she says is not wrong. She's following Paul and Silas around and crying out that these people are the servants of the Most High God and that they bring a message of salvation. Is she wrong about that? No. You could argue that she's actually seeing the truth before anybody else is. And yet the next part I also find uncomfortable, because Paul doesn't exactly cover himself in glory here. Paul gets annoyed. He gets frustrated with her and he reacts. And the whole thing leaves me a bit unsettled here. Because if this is a passage about sharing good news, which is our theme for today, this first story doesn't feel like good news is being shared very well. Rather than speaking of the good news of freedom to the enslaved girl, Paul and Silas end up being arrested themselves and put in chains. There's so much we can unpack in this first part of the story here. But one of the things that I felt was worthwhile noticing is that I could argue that Paul, the great missionary, the great evangelist, mucked it up here. And maybe Luke is being honest enough to actually share that part of the story. Because if we understand, the good news is having the right words to say, he didn't really interact with this enslaved girl at all, other than taking away her gift. So maybe I could say that sharing the good news is more than having the right words, the right arguments, the right presentation. The way that we act around people also matters. Our character matters, our compassion matters, our patience matters. There are moments that we might know the gospel, we might believe the gospel, we might even be able to speak about the gospel, but still fail to embody that good news in the way that we treat the people around us. And one way of looking at this first part of our Bible reading is that Paul wasn't displaying the good news in the way that he reacted to the enslaved girl. I don't know, we can have more discussions about this. It's an interesting part of the Bible reading. But the story does turn, and the second part of the Bible reading is much easier to engage with. Paul and Silas are dragged before the authorities, they're beaten, they're prisoned, they're locked up. And they probably have every right to complain and despair and give up, because this is not fair for them either. They're trying to share good news here and they end up being imprisoned for it. But what do they do in response? At midnight, they begin to sing and pray and praise. And if we were to say that Paul didn't have a good reaction the first time, I would argue this is a good reaction to times of difficulty here. Could we argue that in this moment, Paul and Silas are showing what it looks like to trust God in the middle of hardship. Maybe in their actions now they're starting to say, this is what it means to follow Jesus. They're showing a faith that is real. They're showing that even in this difficult time, they believe that Christ is present. They're showing that suffering does not get the final word, if I want to hark back to my Easter Sunday sermon. And they are showing that praise is possible no matter what the circumstances are. And then, well, you heard the story. The earthquake comes, the doors fly open, the chains come loose. The jailer wakes up and seeing everything going wrong before him. The doors are open. Surely everyone has escaped. He is assuming the worst and he is undone by that. But Paul calls out, do not harm yourself. We're all here. I don't know. In preparing this sermon today, this is the line that's really stuck with me. When Paul says, we're all here. We're all here. You're making an assumption that we've all left, but we're all here. Sure, they had every right to run. They're in there unjustly, Paul and Silas. And so when, the earthquake happens, the walls fall down, the doors come open, they've got every right to think, well, God did this for us. Let's go. Let's go. But instead, Paul stays. Instead, he's wanting to somehow communicate. He's still there. He's still there. And I want to argue this morning, it's at that moment that the jailer understands the good news. By the fact that Paul is still there. Not through a sermon, not through a theological explanation, but through the presence of Paul being still there. Paul staying put when he could have fled was the sermon that the jailer needed to see. And I wonder whether that's part of the invitation that God was stirring up in me when I was writing the sermon. This idea that sometimes sharing the good news with people is simply being there. Being there in the difficult conversations, being there when somebody is grieving, being there when things are awkward, being there in your workplace or in your family or in your community, being there when people are panicking so you can offer peace, being there with kindness when it would be easier just to not be there, being there with steadiness or love or grace. Just being there could be a way of saying, here is what the gospel is about. And as I said, I want to say it was in that moment that the jailer responds. It's almost like the jailer goes, if this is what it means to be a follower of Jesus, then I want to be a follower of Jesus. I actually really like the part of the story that when the jailer responds, it's not only with words for the jailer either, is it? Yes, he says, I want this too, but then goes on and then shows a whole lot of responses in his actions. He tends to their wounds, he brings them to his home, he offers them hospitality. Not only has he heard the good news and responded, he begins to act out that good news himself in the way that he responds. And that blessing spreads to his household. His household is also blessed by that. The ripples sort of move outwards. Because he has seen a sermon, he has responded, and now he is out there preaching the same sermon, and the ripples keep going. When I was thinking of this, I kept on having flashbacks to when I was a teenager. Not only that poem, but another story came to mind of a good friend of my older sister called Julie. When Julie was 17 or so, she came to faith and was very passionate about her faith. She discovered Jesus in a real and significant way. She loved coming to church and to the different youth groups and being part of the community. She loved it. The only difficulty was that her family were not part of the church. Her family were not Christians, and her family didn't understand. And she was really worried about telling her parents that she became a Christian because she didn't know how her family was going to react. The family were quite strong, and she was worried that if she said that she became a Christian, she would be mocked by them, that she would be put down by them, that she would have to try and justify it all, and she didn't know the words to say to them. She didn't know what to do. So she made a decision that if she didn't know what to say, that instead she would just try and show the love of God through her actions. She would try and express what it means to be a Christian by the way that she lived around them. In everything that she did, she would try and be like Jesus. I heard this story much, much later. But I remember her telling me that her family noticed the difference but couldn't work out what was going on. And eventually, after some time, her mum sat her down and said, I don't know what you've got, but I want it too. I want what you've got. I don't know if I could say, taking my line out of my title again, that Julie shared the good news by sitting down and not saying much. Perhaps it would be probably better to say that Julie shared the good news by simply being there, by loving, by serving, by letting the love of Jesus be seen through her. And maybe that's a way of sharing the good news. I feel like I need to say words are still important. Don't get me wrong. Words are still important. Paul still has to speak to the jailer. When the jailer says, what is this about? Paul has to respond with words and does. People still need to hear about Jesus. And at some point, I'm sure that Julie's mother, when she talked to Julie had to try and explain things with words. So whilst I want to affirm that sermons are great, aren't they? Okay. While I want to affirm that sermons are great, that the real impact happens when people see a sermon. That's when the real impact happens. People don't only need an explanation of the gospel, they need to see what the gospel looks like in practice. And perhaps that's the message that's exactly right for us if we're just about to go into the book of Philippians in a few weeks' time. Because that's what Philippians is actually all about. You know, Philippians 2, just read it for yourself this afternoon. Philippians 2 is all about Paul saying, we got to be like Jesus. We got to be like Jesus. So how do I wrap this up? Maybe I can go back a full circle. One of my favourite stories in the Old Testament is from 2 Kings chapter 7. Actually, 2 Kings chapter 6 and 7 are full of stories, like chock-a-block full of great stories. But this one from 2 Kings chapter 7. The city of Samaria is under siege by the Armenian. Is it Armenian? Aramean. Yes, that's better. The Aramean army. The people are trapped inside, and the story goes on that they're all starving on the inside. And this story from 2 Kings chapter 7 is about 4 lepers who are really stuck between a rock and a hard place. They're not allowed in the city because they're lepers, and there's an army outside the city. So they're almost like stuck with, squashed against the city door going, well, what do we do? We can't do anything here. And they say to each other, oh, this is hopeless. We might as well go down to the army and just surrender. And if they kill us, well, we die, but we're going to die here anyway because we're stuck. So the story goes that they go down to the camp where the army is surrounding. And when they arrive at the camp, they find it completely empty. Apparently, God had come to the army the night before and had scared them all, and they had all run away. And so they arrive at this camp, and there is just abundance of food and drink and everything there. And they are just going for it. They're eating, they're drinking, they're having a great time. And one of them says this line. They say, "What we are doing is wrong, is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves." We need to go back and tell the others that this has happened, that we're now free and they can come and eat and drink too. I don't think there's a better analogy for me of what it means to share the good news. If we have found something so amazing in Jesus, it is not right if we keep it to ourselves. It is not right. If we have found in Jesus love and grace and forgiveness and inclusion and guidance and support and peace and assurance, or whatever it is for you, it is not good for us to say, well, this is great for us, but we don't want to share it. Good news is meant to be shared. But I guess what I'm trying to say today is that whilst that seems such a huge barrier to get around by going, but we don't know what to say, we don't know how to start this, one of the answers could be that we just need to make sure that we live out our faith so other people can see. That we need to show that love and that grace that we have received in the way that we treat others. And sure, maybe we might have to work out what we say if somebody says to us, well, why are you like this? But maybe the first step is simply just living it out. The line I liked most from the poem that Lucille read out was that line about, I'd rather someone walk with me than simply tell the way. It really packs a punch with me, that idea that, yes, I can tell people what to do, but what people actually want is for me to walk with them and show them. It is my prayer that our faith might shine clearly through us, not only in our words, but the way that we live. It is my prayer that someone might say to you, I don't know what you've got, but I want it too. I want it too. Amen.